Good morning, and welcome to the 2021 AIM State of Massachusetts Business Address and Economic Outlook Forum. My name is Krista Haggerty. I am the CEO of Dependable Cleaners. I run a third-generation family dry cleaning company, and we've been in business for over 75 years. I am also a member of the AIM Board of Directors. Dependable Cleaners is delighted to host the 2021 AIM Economic Outlook Forum. We, like many small and medium-sized businesses, mustered every bit of creativity, courage, determination, and resilience to navigate the pandemic-driven uncertainties of 2020. I am personally thankful for all of the resources and help that AIM has provided Massachusetts employers. This morning's program will feature the annual State of Massachusetts Business Address from AIM President and CEO John Regan. Immediately following the speech, several distinguished global experts on the economy, manufacturing, healthcare, diversity, and inclusion will offer their reactions. Finally, we will take your questions and comments in a segment moderated by Karen Wallace of AIM. So, what now lies ahead for our Commonwealth and its economy in 2021? How many of the breathtaking changes we saw last year will become permanent parts of the business landscape? Please welcome John Regan, President and CEO of Associated Industries of Massachusetts, for the 2021 State of Massachusetts Business Address.
Thank you, Krista, and thank you to all of the hardworking employees of Dependable Cleaners for hosting us this morning. Dependable Cleaners is in many ways the perfect metaphor for the challenges we face in rebuilding the post-COVID Massachusetts economy. The pandemic reserves some of its harshest consequences for companies like this one, locally owned businesses that are part of our daily lives, where we know the owners and the staff by name. Companies that provide essential services, create good jobs, and sponsor our Little League teams and other local causes. The ability and the willingness of the private and the public sectors to support small businesses as they navigate a rapidly changing world will say a great deal about the Massachusetts economy going forward. The upheaval of 2020 changed almost everything about the way we live and work. It was a year that altered the economy, the workplace, healthcare, manufacturing supply chains, and transportation. It affected schools, government, family life, shopping patterns, the housing market, race relations, and social interactions. But as we look to 2021 with a mixture of caution and hope, we are left to ask, are we forever changed? Did the year of COVID-19, the recession, and a national reckoning on race permanently shift our economic and social foundations, or merely change our habits temporarily as part of a grand detour around multiple crises? Let's ask ourselves, will millions of workers who have successfully done their jobs from home return to the office, or is the future of business now indelibly written across Teams and Zoom boxes? And what does that mean for companies and their need to occupy office space or to build new buildings? Will superstar cities such as Boston resume their place as drivers of the global economy? Or will the ascendance of remote work prompt an exodus of the best and the brightest to lower cost areas? What about the 2/3 of American workers whose jobs do not permit them to work remotely? Will their physical workplaces be forever socially distanced, separated by temperature scans, nasal swabs, and plexiglass? Have public-facing industries such as travel, tourism, hotels, sports, and fine arts been forever altered by changing public attitudes about gathering in groups? Will 65,000 fans again pack Gillette Stadium? Will audiences return to enjoy the Springfield Symphony Orchestra? Is the Boston Convention Center now a relic of a previous time? In a year in which COVID-19 shone a disconcerting light on institutional racism in our communities, our healthcare systems, and our businesses, will society at long last restructure a system that has left millions on the outside looking in? Is the suffocating traffic permanently gone from the highways around Boston and other urban areas? Or will more cars appear back on the roads because people are no longer comfortable taking public transportation? Has the ongoing shift of retail buying to online platforms past the point of no return among customers who continue to point and click their way through COVID quarantines. What does that mean to tens of thousands of our friends and neighbors who work at Main Street retail businesses and now require us to help them gain new skills so they are not left behind? How will the education of our children, including their preparation to participate in the economic life of Massachusetts, be impacted by the jarring migration to remote or hybrid learning? Will classrooms look the same? How will we respond to the fact that these changes have widened disparities between the haves and the have-nots? And will the disproportionate burden that has led 4 times as many women to leave the workforce as men during COVID permanently slow the Massachusetts economy? Will the pandemic-driven strain of working at home, teaching children, and caring for aging parents force women to the sidelines and exacerbate the persistent shortages of skilled workers? The answer to these questions is fundamental to understanding the prospects for the Massachusetts and U.S. economies in the new year. It is also fundamental to developing public policy that balances the solemn task of protecting public health and safety with the equally solemn task of ensuring the economic future of the Commonwealth. It is an enormously difficult balance to achieve. If government does not protect the health, safety, and security of its people, citizens cannot exercise their personal and economic freedoms. But it must not, in the process, abridge those freedoms. The stakes in these policy debates are enormous. Hundreds of thousands of our friends and neighbors in Massachusetts remain out of work because of the pandemic. Many have left the workforce altogether. A quarter of the restaurants in the Commonwealth, 3,600 establishments, have already closed, and more are expected to follow as the winter wears on. The number of small businesses operating in Massachusetts during November was 37% less than in January. Scores of business owners have told me directly that they are hanging on by a thread and may not make it, even with the new stimulus passed by Congress last month. Addressing the COVID crisis by shutting down the economy again and impeding the ability of people to support their families is not a solution. Neither is imposing draconian tax increases to address the state's fiscal issues on the backs of business people trying to keep people employed amid permanent structural changes to the way we live and the way we work. There is an implicit bias built into any attempt to determine whether crisis-driven changes, like the ones we have experienced, are truly historic or merely temporarily significant. It is natural for humans in the midst of a maelstrom to believe that the current situation is the most far-reaching, convulsive, and life-changing event that anyone has ever seen. When a major event happens that poses an existential threat, many of the norms of life change, and some in the short term and some for the long term. The truth is that many of the changes we saw in 2020 will indeed be permanent, but perhaps in a less drastic and more nuanced way than we imagine. We have seen this before, following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. 9/11 made an impact on how we lived, traveled, and behaved. In that period of fear and panic during the fall of 2001, companies stopped allowing their people to travel. Some observers believed that air travel as we knew it would end. A few companies even rethought their presence in overseas markets, and there were state police at every major bridge in Massachusetts. Those policies and attitudes have largely faded, but the airport process that gets us into that smaller seat with less legroom has changed forever. Just try bringing a bottle of water through security, and you'll be reminded of just one of the enduring changes. The catalyst for all of the other changes that will shape the post-COVID world will be a fundamental reimagining of the U.S. workplace. It's an overhaul that is already realigning job opportunities among industries while weakening the physical bonds that have traditionally tied workers to a particular place. While AIM member companies that require workers to be on site, manufacturers, distribution enterprises, grocery stores, and others, operate largely outside of this restructuring, the shifts are creating wholly new operational paradigms for some of the fastest growing sectors of the Massachusetts economy. What the e-commerce revolution did for physical stores, the telepresence revolution could do for office-adjacent employment. Some of the repercussions are positive: less traffic in major urban areas, more flexibility for workers, and expanded opportunities for employers to hire talented people virtually anywhere. The bad news? Cities like Boston that have thrived on proximity-driven innovation and community intellectual energy could see that energy dissipate as companies accelerate the move toward virtual operations. Given the okay to go remote, workers may use their freedom to move to cheaper metros where they can afford more space inside and out. Social observers call this the superstar city exodus. From the employee perspective, the shift is massive and consequential. People are making new choices about where they want to live and creating new expectations about flexibility, working conditions, and the life balance that cannot be undone. A recent survey of 4,700 knowledge workers found that the majority never wanted to go back to the old way of working. Only 12% want to return to full-time office work. 72% want a hybrid remote office model moving forward. Global technology companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and LogMeIn here in Boston have all announced plans to allow large numbers of employees to work at home permanently. The future of Boston affects the entire Massachusetts economy, since the city accounts for 22% of all state economic output and 1 of 6 jobs in the Commonwealth. And there are implications at every level of the economy. Emptier offices mean fewer weekday lunches at restaurants, fewer haircuts, and fewer window shoppers, not to mention less work for office buildings cleaning, security, and maintenance services. Stuart Butterfield, the CEO of Slack, says, "We all know that work will never be the same, even if we don't yet know all the ways in which it will be different." Ravi Kumar, president of Infosys, argues that work will increasingly get disconnected from companies, and jobs and work will increasingly get disconnected from each other. As more work becomes modular, digitized, and disconnected from an office or factory, many more diverse groups of people, those living in rural areas, minorities, stay-at-home moms and dads, and those with disabilities, will be able to compete for it from their homes. And all of this takes place against the sobering reality that 42% of all the job losses from the pandemic will be permanent. We are thus confronted by an economy shaped by crisis, buffeted by structural change, and marked by a delicate balance of risks and opportunities. Workplace changes challenge our concepts of working together, but also make opportunity available to more people in more places. The retail upheaval that has forced iconic brands like JCPenney and Brooks Brothers into bankruptcy and shuttered thousands of small family retail enterprises in Massachusetts is also fueling rapid expansion by e-commerce companies throughout Massachusetts. The painful and contentious summer protests that grew out of the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other people of color, and the deaths of 46,000 Black Americans from COVID-19 have prompted society at large to reevaluate its approach to racial equity and expand the bounds of economic opportunity. The critical shortages of medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, and personal protective equipment early in the COVID crisis has created the opportunity for American companies to reshore the production of critical healthcare infrastructure moving forward. The value of healthcare infrastructure has never been more evident than in the extraordinary development of a COVID-19 vaccine around the world by pharmaceutical companies in just 10 months. Perhaps the most significant scientific achievement since the moon landing. What does all this mean for public policy? In a word, caution. The Massachusetts economy remains remarkably fragile at a time when the structural changes wrought by the pandemic have virtually eliminated the ties that bind companies to locations. 2/3 of companies surveyed by AIM in October reported that sales for 2020 were below projections. To deal with slumping revenues and increased costs, many companies are planning layoffs, furloughs, reduced hours, or pay reductions as current business conditions and the rising cost of complying with state regulations makes continuing operations challenging and uncertain. We are grateful for the extensions of federal stimulus relief for unemployment insurance and other programs like the Paycheck Protection Program. Without those, many businesses could have run out of the support they so desperately need. Many still face tough choices regarding layoffs, relocations, or closures this winter. And traditional Massachusetts economic drivers like healthcare and higher education took a huge hit and haven't fully recovered. This is on top of increased cost pressures on Massachusetts businesses. The Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund alone is projected to have a $5 billion deficit by the end of 2022, meaning that unemployment insurance premiums are expected to increase $319 per employee in 2021, a 60% increase for employers. Raising business costs, particularly business taxes, at this moment risks cutting the thin thread that is keeping thousands of businesses alive and thousands of jobs in place. Massachusetts businesses have responded responsibly to the pandemic by prioritizing their employees and customers, investing in workplace safety protocols, adapting operations to ensure compliance with business-specific requirements, and finding creative ways to offer services and goods while remaining operational. Businesses prioritized these things because this is what our businesses do. They invest, they change, and they adapt. These are the qualities that have made Massachusetts an economic leader for decades. Businesses also taking the race debate as the cue for a more inclusive vision of economic opportunity in Massachusetts. AIM has itself made 9 specific commitments to support the growth of businesses owned by Black and brown people and to ensure that the policies for which we advocate raise up the economic fortunes of all of our fellow citizens. We at AIM believe that business can be a positive force for change in creating a better, more prosperous world. We believe that the role of business is more than bottom lines. We believe that the role of business is to increase value for all of society. We look forward to the opportunity to work with state and federal policymakers, Governor Charlie Baker, the Massachusetts legislature, the Biden administration, and the Congress to ensure that business can realize that vision in a world struggling with both temporary and permanent change. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Brooke Thompson, Executive Vice President of Government Affairs at AIM. We're speaking with Pam Everhart, Senior Vice President, Regional Public Affairs and Community Relations at Fidelity Investments. Pam is also one of the 19 founders of the new Commonwealth Racial Equity and Social Justice Fund. The group has set an ambitious goal of raising at least $100 million and has already begun issuing grants to organizations working on racial equity and social justice matters. Pam, welcome. 2020 has shined a spotlight on racial inequity and racial injustice. And John Regan's speech asked the question, are we forever changed as a result of what transpired in 2020? Pam, in your assessment, with regard to racial equity and justice, are we forever changed by the awakening that took place in 2020?
Thank you, Brooke, and good morning. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you on this very important topic. At the outset, my short answer to your question is, I hope so. The COVID-19 global pandemic disrupted our lives and the economy. It created financial hardship for many and disproportionately resulted in loss of lives among the elderly and Black and brown people. At the same time, in the wake of the brutal murder of George Floyd and other horrific racially charged incidents, issues of racial inequality and social injustice in this country were amplified. Now, while 2020 was a challenge in many ways, it has provided an opportunity for business leaders to be more intentional around and accountable for driving change to more effectively advance racial equity. I think to attract the best talent to remain relevant and be competitive in the future, employers will have to be committed to fair and equitable treatment for every employee, for every customer, and every potential customer, and to create a respectful environment in which all employees are offered an opportunity to add value and be successful. Now more than ever, we need to be well connected to our underserved communities and respond to challenges that stem from racial inequity and social injustice. However, we need to show up in the right way. We need to be holistic in our approach. And most importantly, we need to be authentic.
I was wondering, can you talk a little bit about what you want to see coming out of the new Commonwealth Fund?
Although racial inequities exist at almost every level and area of American society, our fund is initially focused in 4 areas: health equity, policing and criminal justice, youth education, empowerment, and civic engagement. My hope is that our grants will drive sustainable change in these 4 areas and help create solutions to reduce the economic vulnerability of Black and brown families, to break the cycle of poverty and improve the economic inequality of Black and brown communities across the Commonwealth.
I wonder, in your assessment, how do we measure permanent and sustainable change with respect to race relations?
Measuring inclusive practices, accountability, and top talent. So you have to measure the extent to which inclusive practices are embedded in all levels of decision making. Your practices cannot merely be layered on top. Second, there must be accountability for all, and that must be measured. Leaders must commit to new behaviors that will help the entire organization increase diversity and inclusion. And third, top talent. You gotta measure the diversity of that top talent. Your top talent and leadership development programs, as well as opportunities for sponsorship, must be inclusive with an intentional focus on members of underrepresented communities, including people of color. These measurements must also go beyond employees. A company's products and services should resonate with all of its customers, not just the majority.
Thank you, Pam, not only for your amazing insight and thoughts that you've shared with us today, but for your incredible leadership on this issue. We are so thrilled, and I want to thank you again for being here with us today.
Thank you, Brooke.
Good morning. I'm Donna Latson-Gittins, founder of More Advertising in Watertown and a member of the Associated Industries of Massachusetts Board of Directors. Our guest is Edward Glazer, the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard University, and author of the book Triumph of the City: How Our Greatest Invention Makes Us Richer, Smarter, Greener, Healthier, and Happier. Welcome, Professor Glazer.
Thank you so much for talking to me.
To begin, what is the future of cities like Boston in a world where the acceptance of remote work may allow some of the best and brightest do their jobs remotely from lower cost locations?
This is the question that everyone is asking. I do think it depends a lot on whether or not the pandemic risk remains permanent or whether or not we move towards a post-pandemic world. In the latter case, where vaccines are distributed, where we don't have a second wave of pandemic in the next 5 to 10 years, I believe that by and large, things will get back to normal. There is no question that significant numbers of people who have switched to Zooming to work will stay Zooming to work. But I think it runs against the enduring power of cities, both as places of productivity and as places of pleasure. It's not just that we get great ideas by working around with each other, it's also fun.
That's an incredible introduction to the next question. Will high-cost superstar cities in general continue to be the drivers of economic growth?
Well, I think there'll be a little bit less high cost, quite honestly. I think it would be very, very shocking if the decline in demand for working face-to-face doesn't lead to some kind of drop in commercial real estate prices. I think, by and large, cities that are strong in their human capital, cities that are strong in connecting, will continue to thrive, even though they will be a little bit cheaper. But not every city is ordained to succeed. And I think when we think about policy going forward, local governments, state governments need to understand that this is a moment of vulnerability and that they really need to pay attention to providing the kinds of business environment that businesses need.
So how will now embedded concerns about gatherings affect the service economy, restaurants, retail stores, hotels, the symphony? That helps to define the quality of life in cities.
You're absolutely right. And again, I think this depends crucially on whether or not vaccines work and the pandemic risk abates. You know, in 2019, 1/5 of American workers, 32 million of them, labored in retail, trade, leisure, and hospitality. Those jobs are incredibly vulnerable to pandemic. So it's incredibly important that we make the kind of health investments we need to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And if we do those things, if the pandemic risk abates, I think we will be back in the symphony as soon as we possibly can.
What will the workplace changes that John Regan outlined, how would that affect the cost and the availability of housing in major metropolitan centers?
So I think it's quite likely that you will see some conversion of commercial space to residential space. Mm-hmm. If you think about where the enduring appeal of urban life comes from, ultimately it is more guaranteed by our desire to be near other human beings, to enjoy life together with other human beings, than it is necessarily by our need to work next to other human beings. And so I think there will be a bit of a conversion of commercial to residential space that will tend to make things a bit cheaper. So that there should be some modest drop in the cost of living.
But it also sounds like transportation getting around is a question. So what role will public transportation play in the ability of cities to emerge from the current crisis? Will workers ever return to crowded MBTA trains and buses? Or has the battery of the urban economy been permanently severed?
Well, it's certainly going to be a rough time, and it has been a rough time for the MBTA. But again, I think it's a question of how quickly the pandemic risk ends. In the medium run, if it's safe, people will go back. I mean, the T is just too convenient. It's too hard to get around without it.
And cars on the road, will we see a lot more of those?
We certainly need to be careful about this. Boston was not easy to drive around pre-pandemic, and it would be great if it could be made a little bit easier post-pandemic.
Well, amid the challenges that large cities face, is it also fair to say that some of the knowledge that has brought us through the pandemic, from remote communication platforms to the Moderna vaccine, could only have been developed in a city like Boston?
I think there is a lot to be, there are lots of things to be proud of. I think the pharmaceutical industry has done unbelievably well in terms of vaccine development. I think that's something that's unquestionably Boston should be very proud of. The human capital in this region is exceptional, and it remains the surest guarantee that Boston will continue to be a capital of the information age for decades to come.
Professor Edward Glaser, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you for talking to me.
Hello, I'm Kristen Rupert, Senior Vice President for External Affairs at AIM. And with me today is Nada Sanders, Distinguished Professor of Supply Chain Management at Northeastern University. Nada has provided consulting services to a wide variety of Fortune 500 companies, including Mattel, Nike, Dell, IDG, and others. She's also quoted widely in the press. Nada. We're hearing a lot about reshoring, particularly as it relates to the shortages of PPE experienced in the U.S. over the past year. Can you talk a little bit about this?
First, thank you for having me, Kristen. And yes, what we saw with the pandemic was these massive supply chain disruptions across the board, from toilet paper to PPE and so forth. The response has been, well, how about reshoring? The reality of it is that it is simply untenable, unrealistic to do that. We could not scale production. We don't have many of the component parts and resources. It would be a massive effort, not to mention that costs of products would skyrocket. So what is the answer? The answer, I think, is twofold. One, I think companies need to diversify their supplier portfolio in a lot of ways, and one is by location. So yes, there's going to be some reshoring, but we should continue with China, consider Southeast Asia, Mexico, and other regions in order to create a portfolio of suppliers that is balanced, so we balance out our risks. And the second aspect is, I think, investing in technology to provide visibility, to be able to see up the supply chain where the problems are.
Now let's talk about digitization. Certainly the past year has accelerated the movement towards digital commerce. You're a forecaster. Are we going to continue to see this? What's it going to look like over the next years?
Digitization is here to stay. I think it is naive to think that we're going to go back to the same habits, that consumers are going to go back to the same habits. They're not. So that poses a whole host of challenges for businesses in a lot of different ways. They're going to have to figure out ways in order to move products when you're actually handling one item at a time versus pallets. They're also going to have to consider things like what's called co-opetition, where you work with your competitors to pool resources and to aggregate in order to jointly be able to respond to the market.
Okay, that's a good lead into my next question, which is companies talk about how the events of the past year have forced them to reimagine their businesses and build resilience. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Kristen, it's a great question. Every company that I'm talking to, and I'm talking to a lot of companies across industry sectors, the magic word is, or there are multiple magic words. One is resilience. We have to build resilience. Two is we have to pivot. And that's what I hear across the board. But what I believe is really important for companies is to reimagine, to reinvent. And I think it's not going to be looking at historical data. We've already seen that historical data does not indicate what the future is going to look like. We are in uncharted territories. One of the suggestions I have is for companies to consider something that certain companies like Ford has done. They have actually a futurist. The idea is to create a process where the team ideates differently, where the team ideates about what customers are going to be doing, what they're going to be wanting, and how the company can reinvent itself, reimagine its product offering, its delivery, its position in the marketplace. Just surveying consumers and customers is not going to cut it.
Okay, I've got one more question for you, a little bit different. Investment. So as companies look at investments over the coming months and years, and as the U.S. government looks at investments, what are we likely to see?
I think that healthcare in every aspect of it. And I mean end to end, from medicine, the medical community, to PPE, to pharma.
Thank you. All right. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you, Nada Sanders of Northeastern University, for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you for having me.
Good morning. My name is Vasundar Sangar, and I am Associate Vice President of Government Affairs here at AIM. Our guest today is Dr. Lee Schwam, a neurologist and Director of the Center for Telehealth at Massachusetts General Hospital and the System-Wide Vice President for Virtual Care at Mass General Brigham. Dr. Schwam, thank you so much for being here with us this morning.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
As a physician and as someone with telehealth expertise specifically, you've seen firsthand how technology was able to change the delivery of healthcare throughout the pandemic. Do you see these trends continuing post-pandemic?
There's no question in my mind that virtual care is here to stay. We went from doing several thousand visits a week to doing 1.38 million visits virtually. What you can see here in this graph is shown the ambulatory visits in person in the first half of the fiscal year, right up until the middle of March, where you can see an enormous drop-off in the volume of care. The dark blue bars indicate when virtual visits were first implemented, and you can see that over the course of the next several months until the end of September, virtual visits help to restore care for those who need it the most without any suggestion of overutilization or inappropriate use.
Beyond the virtual delivery of healthcare, do you see some other ways where the healthcare system will look permanently different post-pandemic?
Well, I think we had to make a lot of choices during the pandemic to figure out what the best way to deliver care was in the most efficient manner, how to streamline our governance so that we could be more nimble. And so I think what you're going to see is many more people will be able to work from home if their role doesn't require them to be physically present. I think we're going to have a more flexible understanding of how to assemble teams together. And I think we may see, at least in the academic medical center environment, a change in the way we govern.
Healthcare has been a driver of the Massachusetts economy for decades. We've seen all the losses that it suffered throughout the pandemic, not including a significant number of job loss. Do you see the sector resuming its role as an economic engine once COVID-19 has been dealt with further?
I think it's a tremendous opportunity. It's sort of the equivalent of the green revolution in, energy delivery. I think that what we realize now is we have built up an enormous bolus of unmanaged chronic disease. People avoided seeking healthcare because they were afraid to come in. We're going to pay the price for that. We're going to see more disease events. And so we have to figure out how we can reach out. And rather than worried about overutilization, I'm worried about underutilization. We have to bring patients back into managed care. Our virtual care programs were enormously helpful for patients with behavioral health and substance use disorders. And we know they consume a disproportionate amount of resources. So telehealth, virtual care, gives us an ability to reach out and maintain connectivity with those patients, helping them avoid unnecessary visits to the office with lots of ancillary costs. So I think we have an opportunity to be a major driver of the economy in the coming, sort of 3 to 6 quarters by leveraging the gains that we developed with our virtual care understanding and layering them on top of a post-pandemic environment.
Awesome. And this one's a little bit of a more personal question, but as a physician yourself, were you surprised to witness the global vulnerability to the pandemic?
We work very hard in medicine to create what we call high reliability systems with lots of fail-safes so that we are prepared to switch out whatever we're doing with something else if it doesn't work. We did not have a backup medical delivery system here that was primed and ready to go. I think going forward we will. There's no reason why we shouldn't think about virtual care as the equivalent of the National Guard or the Army Reserve.
And this really builds off of that. Some of the primary lessons that you think we should take away from a crisis of this magnitude?
The most important lesson to me is just how vulnerable a sector of our population was and how poorly served. And I just don't think we can ever let that happen again. We have to build more robust systems to ensure that whatever your language, whatever your ethnicity, whatever your background, whatever your financial status, we have a way to embrace you. I think the second thing is to realize that a lot of things we didn't think we could do with technology, we really can do.
Those were some great topics that we touched on. And again, thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. And your membership is the one that's going to drive regulatory change and ensure that employers are getting the care they need for their employees. So I'm delighted to participate in this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.